It was 2:40 on a Tuesday afternoon when a police officer grabbed a disabled combat veteran by both arms, pulled him out of his wheelchair, and pinned him face down on the hot asphalt of a pharmacy parking lot. The veteran didn't fight back. He couldn't have, even if he'd wanted to. He simply kept repeating one sentence, over and over, in a voice that stayed steady, even as his face pressed into the pavement. "My legs don't work. Please. My legs don't work." Nobody listened. Not until a bystander's cell phone video, 31 seconds long, reached the internet later that evening, and by the following morning, that same 31 seconds had triggered something no one standing in that parking lot could have predicted: a federal civil rights investigation into an entire police precinct, launched in under 5 hours from the moment the footage first started circulating. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway, a man who survived an explosion halfway around the world that took the use of his legs, only to find himself, 4 years later, face down in a parking lot 2 miles from his own front door, being handcuffed by an officer who never once asked why he couldn't stand up. Stay with us, because what happened over the next 5 hours didn't just change one department. It changed how an entire city thought about who gets believed and who doesn't, in the space of a single interaction with the people sworn to protect them. Every officer who touched that wheelchair that afternoon would later say they were simply following the training they'd been given. And that, more than anything else, is exactly what makes this story worth sitting with all the way to the end. Because the training itself was the problem nobody had bothered to look at for years, until one Tuesday afternoon made it impossible to look away. Derek Holloway grew up in a small town where almost everyone he knew either worked the local plant or left for the military the moment they turned 18. He chose the second path, enlisting in the army 3 days after his high school graduation, following a family tradition that stretched back 2 generations before him. He served 11 years, 2 deployments, a reputation among the men and women who served alongside him as the kind of soldier other soldiers wanted next to them when things went wrong, steady under pressure, quick to laugh even in miserable conditions, fiercely protective of the people in his unit. Things went wrong for Derek Holloway on a routine patrol during his second deployment, when the vehicle he was riding in struck a roadside explosive device. 2 of the 4 men in that vehicle didn't survive. Derek did, but the blast shattered his lower spine so severely that despite 4 surgeries and nearly 2 years of rehabilitation, he never regained the use of his legs. He remembers very little of the explosion itself, a flash, a sound he still can't fully describe, and then waking up in a field hospital, unable to feel anything below his waist, surrounded by medical staff whose expressions told him more than their words did before any doctor formally explained what had happened. The 2 years that followed were, in his own words, harder than the explosion itself, a slow, grinding process of learning to live inside a body that no longer communicated with him the way it once had. He learned to transfer himself from bed to chair, from chair to car, from car to shower, each transition requiring months of physical therapy to master safely. He learned to recognize and manage the phantom nerve pain that flared unpredictably along the exact pathway of his spinal injury, pain that, years later, would flare again in that pharmacy parking lot the moment his shoulder was wrenched during his struggle with Officer Bramwell. Nobody tells you, when you come home from something like that the hardest part isn't the wheelchair itself, Derek said in an interview months after the incident. The hardest part is that everyone around you has an idea of what a person in a wheelchair is supposed to look like, move like, sound like. And when you don't match that idea exactly, people start filling in the gaps with their own assumptions. Usually those assumptions are harmless. Sometimes they're not. He came home to a country that gave him a Purple Heart, a wheelchair, and, in the years that followed, very little else in the way of guidance for what came next. What he built instead, he built largely on his own. He earned a degree in social work through a veterans education program and spent the following 3 years working directly with other injured veterans navigating the same maze of disability benefits, adaptive housing applications, and physical therapy scheduling that had nearly broken him in his own first-year home. He became, without ever intending to, something of a quiet local advocate, the kind of person other veterans in the area called first when they didn't understand a form, or needed someone who actually knew what a spinal cord injury clinic visit felt like from the inside, not just from a policy manual. That Tuesday afternoon, Derek had driven himself, in his specially adapted vehicle, to a pharmacy 2 miles from his apartment to pick up a prescription refill, a routine errand he'd made dozens of times before, using the same accessible parking space near the store's entrance, the same manual transfer from his driver's seat into his wheelchair that he'd performed thousands of times since his rehabilitation ended. He had no idea, pulling into that parking lot, that in the next 40 minutes, a misunderstanding over a parking placard would end with him pinned face down on hot asphalt, his shoulder wrenched hard enough to reopen a nerve injury from his time overseas that had taken over a year to heal the first time. What Derek also had no idea of that afternoon was that the officer approaching his vehicle, a 3-year veteran of the department named Kyle Bramwell, had received a call less than 10 minutes earlier from the pharmacy's assistant manager, reporting what she described as a suspicious vehicle repeatedly using the disabled parking space, a description based entirely on the fact that she had seen the same vehicle parked there twice that week, and, without checking the visible placard hanging from the rearview mirror, had assumed, incorrectly, that it belonged to an employee abusing the accommodation rather than a disabled customer legitimately entitled to use it. Bramwell had joined the department 3 years earlier after a brief prior career in private security, and colleagues later described him, in the aftermath of the incident, as generally well regarded, but prone to what one fellow officer called tunnel vision on a call, a tendency to form an initial read on a situation quickly and then interpret everything that followed through that same initial lens, rather than updating his assessment as new information came in. His personnel file contained no prior disciplinary actions, though it also, investigators later noted, contained no record that he had ever completed any disability awareness training beyond a single half-day orientation session during his initial academy training 3 years earlier, a session that, according to the department's own curriculum records, had not been updated or repeated since he joined the force. Bramwell, arriving at the scene with that second-hand assumption already shaping his approach, walked up to Derek's vehicle just as Derek was completing his transfer from the driver's seat into his wheelchair, a process that, for a paraplegic veteran using a manual chair, takes real time, real upper body strength, and real concentration, and which, to someone unfamiliar with it, can look unusual, effortful, even suspicious if you don't understand exactly what you're watching. "Sir, I need to see your parking placard and your ID," Bramwell said, before Derek had even fully settled into his chair. "Of course," Derek answered, still catching his breath from the transfer. "It's hanging right there on the mirror. My ID's in my jacket pocket. I'll grab it for you." "Don't reach into your jacket. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Officer, I'm a disabled veteran. My placard is right there. I'm just going to reach for my wallet, slowly, if that's all right." What happened over the next several minutes would later be reconstructed from 3 sources: Officer Bramwell's own body camera, a second responding officer's body camera, and the 31-second bystander video that would ultimately reach millions of views within 24 hours. Bramwell, according to that footage, remained convinced that Derek's slow, effortful movements, the careful shifting of weight, the deliberate positioning of his hands on the wheelchair's push rims, were signs of evasiveness rather than what they actually were: the ordinary, practiced movements of a man who had spent 4 years learning exactly how to manage a body that no longer worked the way it used to. "Sir, I need you to step out of the chair and place your hands on the vehicle." Derek, for the first time in the encounter, felt something shift from confusion into real alarm. "Officer, I can't step out. I'm paralyzed from the waist down. I physically cannot stand. I don't know how else to explain this to you. I need you to comply with my instructions." "I am complying. I'm telling you, as clearly as I possibly can, that what you're asking me to do is not physically possible for me. Please, just check the placard. It's right there. Bramwell did not check the placard. Instead, according to both his own body camera footage and the bystander's video, he reached down, took hold of Derek's arm, and attempted to physically lift him from the wheelchair, an action that, combined with Derek's genuine inability to support his own weight, or brace himself the way an able-bodied person instinctively would, caused both men to lose balance. Derek went down hard onto the pavement, his shoulder taking the brunt of the fall, his wheelchair tipping and rolling several feet away, suddenly out of reach. What the bystander's video captured next, the 31 seconds that would end up defining this entire story, was Bramwell, now joined by a second officer who had just arrived on scene, pinning Derek face down on the hot asphalt, one knee pressed into his upper back, both of Derek's arms pulled behind him for handcuffing, while Derek, unable to use his legs to reposition himself, unable to do anything but keep his head turned to the side to breathe, repeated the same sentence over and over, in a voice that never rose to a shout, never lost its composure, even as pain from his old nerve injury flared through his shoulder and down what remained of the sensation in his upper back. "My legs don't work. Please, my legs don't work." The bystander who filmed that footage, a college student named Jasmine Ortiz, who had been walking into the pharmacy at the exact moment the encounter escalated, later said in an interview that she almost didn't pull out her phone at all, that her first instinct was simply confusion, watching two officers struggle with a man whose empty wheelchair sat several feet away, tipped onto its side. "It didn't make sense to me what I was seeing," she said, "and then I heard him say it. My legs don't work. And I understood immediately what was happening, and I knew I needed to record it, because I had this sick feeling that if I didn't, nobody was ever going to believe exactly how this went down." Jasmine stood roughly 15 feet away, phone raised, her hands shaking badly enough that portions of the footage are visibly unsteady, a detail she later said she was almost embarrassed by, until an attorney reviewing the footage months later told her that the shakiness of her hands, if anything, only reinforced the authenticity and spontaneity of what she'd captured. She said nothing during the recording beyond a single, quiet, "Oh my God," roughly 20 seconds in, the moment Derek's shoulder audibly wrenched as Bramwell repositioned his grip. She did not approach the officers. She did not shout. She simply kept recording, backing up slowly toward the pharmacy entrance, until Sergeant Ferreira arrived and the restraint ended. Only then did she lower her phone, walk directly up to Ferreira, and identify herself as a witness willing to provide the footage. A decision that, combined with her quick thinking to keep recording rather than intervening physically, later drew explicit praise from federal investigators reviewing the case, who noted that her footage, time-stamped and unedited, became one of the single most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Derek was handcuffed, still face down, for nearly 4 minutes before a third responding officer, a 12-year veteran named Sergeant Luis Ferreira, who had been dispatched separately after a second 911 call from a horrified onlooker, arrived on scene, took one look at the situation, and immediately ordered both officers to remove the handcuffs. "Get him up. Get him into his chair. Now," Ferreira said, according to his own body camera footage, the first moment in the entire encounter where any officer present appeared to fully grasp what had actually happened. Derek was helped back into his wheelchair, his shoulder throbbing, a nerve injury he had spent over a year recovering from now visibly worse, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the physical toll of having been forcibly restrained in a position his body was never able to safely hold. He did not raise his voice. He did not immediately threaten legal action. He simply asked Sergeant Ferreira, in a voice still remarkably steady, given everything that had just happened, for badge numbers, for a supervisor's contact information, and for someone to please retrieve the pharmacy bag that had fallen from his lap sometime during the struggle. Ferreira, to his credit, insisted on calling paramedics to the scene, despite Derek's initial protest that he simply wanted to go home. The paramedics who examined him, roughly 20 minutes later, documented visible swelling and reduced range of motion in his right shoulder, along with Derek's own account of sharp, radiating pain along the same nerve pathway injured in his original combat wound. He was transported to a nearby emergency room, where an MRI performed later that evening confirmed a partial re-tear of tissue that had taken over a year of physical therapy to repair the first time. Derek's sister, Michelle, who lived 20 minutes away and had been listed as his emergency contact since his return from deployment, arrived at the hospital within the hour, having received a call from Ferreira himself rather than learning about the incident secondhand. She later described walking into that emergency room and seeing her brother, a man who had survived an actual roadside explosion without losing his composure, visibly shaken in a way she said she had never witnessed in the 4 years since his injury. "He kept apologizing to me for making me leave work early," she said. That's who Derek is. Even lying in a hospital bed after what had just happened to him, he was worried about inconveniencing someone else. It made me so angry, watching him do that, because I knew exactly why he does it. He spent 4 years training himself to minimize his own needs so other people don't feel burdened by them. And this officer had just proven, in the worst possible way, exactly why that training doesn't protect him the way it should. Jasmine Ortiz's video was uploaded to social media at 3:22 that afternoon, less than 40 minutes after the incident occurred. By 4 p.m., it had been shared several thousand times. By 5 p.m., it had crossed 100,000 views, picked up by a regional news outlet whose social media team had spotted it trending locally. By 6:15 p.m., a national veterans advocacy organization, one that Derek had actually volunteered with for the better part of 2 years, had identified him by name from the footage and issued a public statement demanding immediate accountability. An organization with enough institutional weight and enough existing relationships with both local media and federal oversight bodies that its statement did something no ordinary viral video, on its own, typically accomplishes. It moved the story from public outrage into formal institutional action within a matter of hours, rather than the weeks or months such escalation usually requires. By 7:30 that evening, the city's mayor had issued a statement expressing deep concern and announcing an internal review, a standard, cautious first response that, under ordinary circumstances, might have been the extent of any consequence for weeks to come. But circumstances that Tuesday were anything but ordinary, because Derek Holloway's advocacy work over the previous 3 years had put him in direct, regular contact with a regional office of the Department of Veterans Affairs, whose director, upon seeing the footage and recognizing Derek immediately, made a personal call to a contact within the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, a call placed not because of any formal jurisdiction over the incident itself, but because the footage, combined with Derek's own well-documented history of advocacy work with disabled veterans throughout the region, raised immediate red flags about whether this represented an isolated failure or something the department had seen before and never adequately addressed. That VA director, a woman named Carol Whitmore who had worked directly with Derek on at least a dozen separate veteran benefits cases over the previous 3 years, later described watching the footage for the first time as one of the more surreal moments of her career. "I recognized his voice before I recognized his face," she said. "I've sat across a desk from Derek Holloway more times than I can count, watching him fight for other veterans who couldn't fight for themselves. And there he was, on my phone screen, having to fight for something as basic as being believed about his own body. I made that call within 10 minutes of watching the video. I didn't think twice about it." Whitmore's contact within the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, a career attorney who had worked disability rights cases for nearly 15 years, later confirmed that while the video itself would likely have eventually drawn federal attention on its own, given how quickly it was spreading, Whitmore's call, combined with the specific, credible context she was able to provide about Derek's public advocacy history, accelerated the department's response by what he estimated was likely several days, if not longer. By 7:47 p.m., just over 5 hours after Officer Bramwell first approached Derek's vehicle, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had opened a formal preliminary inquiry into the precinct. Not yet the full consent decree process that would eventually follow, but the critical first step that, once triggered, set in motion a chain of document requests, personnel file reviews, and mandatory preservation orders for years of prior use of force records. What federal investigators found, once they began pulling those records over the following weeks, was not a single officer's isolated mistake, but a pattern eerily specific to how the precinct handled encounters involving visible or non-visible disabilities. Over the preceding 4 years, the precinct had received at least 9 separate citizen complaints, specifically describing situations where officers had failed to recognize, accommodate, or appropriately respond to a disability during a stop or arrest, including 2 prior incidents involving wheelchair users, one involving a deaf resident who had been forcibly restrained for failing to respond to verbal commands he could not hear, and one involving an individual experiencing a diabetic medical episode that officers had initially treated as intoxication or resistance. Investigators interviewed several of those 9 complainants directly during the following weeks, building a fuller picture of exactly how each complaint had been handled, or, more accurately, how each had been closed without meaningful action. One complainant, a woman named Ruth Alvarez who used a motorized wheelchair following a stroke 5 years earlier, described an incident nearly identical in structure to Derek's, though far less severe in its physical outcome. An officer who had insisted she stand up and walk to the curb during a minor traffic incident involving her adapted vehicle, becoming visibly frustrated when she was physically unable to comply, before a second officer intervened and de-escalated the situation. Her complaint, filed the following day, had been closed within 2 weeks, as handled through officer counseling, with no documented follow-up training requirement attached to the closure. When I saw Derek's video, I felt sick, Alvarez said, in an interview conducted after the federal investigation became public. Not just because of what happened to him, but because I remembered filing my own complaint years earlier and being told it was being taken seriously. I believed that. I don't think I believe it anymore. None of those 9 complaints had resulted in any disability-specific training update for the department. Investigators later determined that the precinct's use of force training curriculum, unchanged for nearly 6 years, contained no specific module addressing interactions with individuals with visible mobility impairments, hearing impairments, or medical conditions that could visibly resemble non-compliance to an officer unfamiliar with the underlying condition. Officer Bramwell, still on active duty status as the investigation unfolded, was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours, a decision the department's chief announced personally at a hastily arranged press conference, standing beside the city's mayor, visibly aware that the cameras assembled that morning represented a level of national attention the department had never previously experienced. "What happened to Staff Sergeant Holloway should never have happened," the chief said, reading from a prepared statement that nonetheless carried an unmistakable weight of genuine strain in his voice. "We are fully cooperating with the Department of Justice's review, and effective immediately, every officer in this department will undergo new, mandatory training on recognizing and appropriately responding to visible and non-visible disabilities during any citizen encounter." That promise, delivered within the first 24 hours, would ultimately prove to be only the earliest and smallest piece of what followed. Over the next several weeks, as federal investigators expanded their review beyond Bramwell's individual conduct into the broader pattern of complaints the precinct had failed to meaningfully address, the scope of the inquiry grew substantially. What began as a review of a single officer's actions in a pharmacy parking lot became a full civil rights investigation into the precinct's entire approach to disability accommodation across use of force incidents, arrest procedures, and even the physical accessibility of the precinct's own holding facilities. A detail investigators flagged after discovering that the precinct's booking area itself contained no wheelchair-accessible holding cell, meaning that had Derek Holloway actually been formally arrested and processed that afternoon, the department would have had no adequate facility in which to hold him. Derek, for his part, did not immediately pursue a lawsuit, a decision that surprised several attorneys who reached out to him in the days following the incident, offering to represent him in what most agreed would likely become a significant civil rights case. He waited nearly 3 weeks before formally retaining counsel, a delay he later explained simply. "I didn't want my first move to be about money," he said in one of the only extended interviews he gave about the incident, seated in his apartment, his shoulder still wrapped in a brace from the re-injury sustained during the encounter. "I wanted to understand first whether this was actually going to change anything, or whether it was going to be a press conference and a training video nobody actually sat through. I've seen enough institutions make promises after a bad headline. I needed to see if this one was serious before I decided what I was going to do about it." What ultimately convinced him to move forward with a formal legal claim was not the initial administrative leave, or even the department's public apology, but a private meeting he requested, and was granted, with the federal investigators leading the Department of Justice's inquiry, a meeting in which he was shown, for the first time, the full scope of the 9 prior disability-related complaints the precinct had failed to meaningfully address. "That's when I understood this wasn't really about me," he said. "I was just the one whose 31 seconds happened to go viral. There were at least 9 other people before me who tried to tell someone the same thing I was telling that officer on the ground, and nobody listened to them either. I filed my claim for them as much as for myself." Derek's civil lawsuit against the city, filed 6 weeks after the incident. It was ultimately resolved through a settlement, reached 8 months later, a figure his attorneys described publicly only as substantial, used in part to fund a training program Derek personally helped design in consultation with disability rights advocates and use of force experts, aimed specifically at closing the exact training gap federal investigators had identified in the precinct's curriculum. Officer Bramwell was formally terminated 4 months after the incident, following an internal disciplinary review that concluded his use of force had been objectively unreasonable given the clear and repeated verbal indications of Derek's disability throughout the encounter. He did not appeal the termination. The second officer involved in the physical restraint received a lesser disciplinary action, a 60-day suspension without pay and mandatory retraining after investigators determined he had, at multiple points during the encounter, expressed hesitation to colleagues that was documented on his own body camera audio, but had ultimately deferred to Bramwell's lead rather than intervening. Sergeant Louis Ferreira, the officer who arrived and immediately ordered Derek's release from restraint, was publicly commended by the department for his handling of the situation once he arrived on scene, though several disability rights advocates following the case pointed out in public commentary at the time an uncomfortable tension in that commendation, that the appropriate response Ferreira demonstrated should have been the baseline expectation for every officer on that call, from the very first moment. Not a standout exception worthy of special recognition against the very low bar set by his colleagues. The Department of Justice's full findings, released just over a year after the incident, went considerably further than the department's own internal review. The federal report concluded that the precinct's training deficiencies around disability accommodation reflected, in the report's own language, a systemic failure to update use of force protocols in response to a demonstrable and repeated pattern of complaints, resulting in foreseeable harm to some of the community's most vulnerable residents. The resulting consent decree mandated a complete overhaul of the department's disability response training, physical accessibility upgrades to the precinct's own facilities, a new requirement that any complaint involving a disabled individual be automatically escalated to a specialized review unit rather than the department's standard internal affairs process, and an independent monitor tasked with reviewing compliance for a minimum of 4 years. Jasmine Ortiz, whose 31-second video had started the entire chain of events, was later invited by Derek himself to speak alongside him at a community forum held 6 months after the incident, an invitation she described as one of the most meaningful moments of her young adult life. "I almost didn't record it," she told the room that evening. "I want anyone listening to this to understand, if you see something that doesn't sit right with you, and your gut tells you to document it, trust that instinct. You genuinely never know whose story you might be helping tell." Derek Holloway, for his part, returned to his advocacy work within weeks of the incident, resuming his role, helping other veterans navigate the same complicated systems that had once nearly overwhelmed him during his own recovery. He has said, in the time since, that the hardest part of the entire experience was never the physical pain of the re-injury to his shoulder, but something quieter and harder to fully explain to people who hadn't lived it. "I spent 2 years after my injury learning how to be believed again," he said. "Learning how to walk into a room in a wheelchair and have people actually listen to what I was telling them about my own body, instead of deciding they already understood it better than I did. I thought I'd gotten good at that. And then one Tuesday afternoon, none of that mattered at all, because the person in front of me had already decided what he was seeing before I ever opened my mouth." He has since become an occasional speaker at police academy training sessions in the region, invited specifically to walk new recruits through his own experience, not as a lecture on outrage, but as a direct, practical walkthrough of exactly what a disabled person's body language, movements, and verbal responses actually look like during a stressful encounter, and why those signals are so often, tragically, misread by officers who have never been specifically trained to recognize them. "I don't do this to make anyone feel guilty," he tells every group he speaks to. "I do it because I know, statistically, some of you are going to encounter someone like me during a stop at some point in your career. I would rather spend an hour of my time now making sure you actually understand what you're looking at, than read about the next version of my own story happening to someone else." The pharmacy parking lot where the incident occurred looks exactly the same today as it did before any of this happened. The accessible parking space is still there, the same faded blue paint outlining the same rectangle of pavement Derek had parked in dozens of times before that Tuesday, and dozens of times since. He still uses that pharmacy. He has said, more than once, that he made a deliberate choice not to avoid it. "If I stop going somewhere every time something like this happens, I've let it win in a way that has nothing to do with any lawsuit or settlement," he said. "I go back to that parking lot because it's my parking lot too. That was always the whole point." If this story made you think twice about who gets believed, about accountability, and about what it actually takes for a system to finally look honestly at itself, do 3 things for us right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what part of this story stuck with you the most, and subscribe so you never miss the next story of justice, resilience, and the fight for real accountability. 5 hours changed everything for one precinct. 9 prior complaints had already been quietly telling the same story for years, long before anyone was finally forced to listen. Imagine what could change if every complaint got that same 5 hours of attention, not just the one that happened to be caught on a bystander's phone. We'll see you in the next one.